Hey internets. So this video is going to be the very first quarterly QA session. I get a lot of really good comments on my videos and a lot of really good questions, and I figured, you know what, why don't I just commit to the occasional video where I actually go over some of you guys' questions and give you guys some answers. Considering where my health is currently at, I figure I can at least do 4 of these per year. So I'll commit to doing at least 1 more of these by the end of 2025. And yes, just like my subscriber milestone Redpills sessions, subscribe star and channel members get first dibs. Deal with it. Anyways, let's start with this question. Any plans to deep dive into shareholder primacy? You know, that's a good question, probably something for its own entire video. For those that don't know, it's just the idea that the main goal of a corporation should be to maximize the value for its shareholders, or that their main goal should really just be to make their shareholders wealthy. And the thing about it is that it really brings forth the question is, how much do time preferences matter on a corporate scale? Because of course the problem with it is that when your only real goal is to just maximize wealth for shareholders, this can also lead to some kind of short-term thinking of where you get wealthier in the short run because you aren't sure what will happen in the long run, and so corporations end up kind of making these self-destructive decisions. But there's another question here. Can we have an Ron Paul was right merch? And you know what? The answer to that is yes, we can. Just for you, I've created a shirt and a mug so that you can remind people that Ron Paul was indeed correct about pretty much everything, strangely enough. And what the heck, I'll have it on an introductory sale. So you can get it and anybody else can get it. All profits directly go towards helping me buy more Fumos. I mean, food. Yeah, food. So yeah, link to all that will be in the description below. Anyways, next question. If the Libertarian Party was actually going to put work into being successful, how wide should the tent be? Yeah, starting off with kind of a big one there. That just kind of goes alongside the question of what should libertarian strategy be? Because the thing is, what makes Republicans and Democrats so successful is that they largely just kind of adopt a consequentialist strategy of it's a good idea if it gives us more power. And while that does kind of work in regards to making them the major political parties, the problem is it also makes it so that they don't really have a consistent message. They don't really believe in anything with any kind of logical consistency. I mean, the Democrats are kind of loosely on the left and the Republicans are kind of loosely considered the right-wing party in the United States. But then when you actually start to try and examine the differences more seriously, you realize that a lot of them are just tiny concessions rather than significant differences, which is very bad from a philosophy standpoint, but from a political standpoint in terms of gaining power, it's very effective. Very stupid, but very effective. And this is where the Libertarian Party kind of really runs into some serious issues, because the Libertarian Party, well, libertarianism is really more of a philosophy than it is a political party. A lot of people don't realize that, which is overall a good thing in terms of being logically consistent, but in terms of being successful politically is kind of a bad thing, because it makes us get tied up in a lot of gatekeeping in favor of actually getting things done. Which means that a lot of times what has happened in history is that the Libertarian Party has traditionally just kind of found itself, unfortunately, stuck in the Republican Party's shadow, being the more well-read, more pro-free market, more high IQ right-wingers, but stuck at low support levels despite being superior due to these problems. Personally, what I think we should do is we should kind of adopt a more strategy towards at least making things better. This is another thing that could use its entire video, but the TLDR of it is we need to stop letting perfect be the enemy of better. With a good example of doing this successfully would be looking at what the Young Americans for Liberty have been doing lately. They cast a wider net in order to focus on more realistic, more obtainable goals towards at least reducing the government, with the result being something that isn't necessarily perfect, but at least you're getting some level of liberty in your lifetime. Hope that makes some sense. Anyways, next question. Regarding epistemology, are you more aligned with the Aristotelian objectivist approach like Rothbard/Kinsella, or the Kantian like Mises/Hoppe? So I lean more towards Hoppe, however, I must say that they're honestly not as contradictory as people think. Kind of going back to the previous question I answered, this is one of those things that people sometimes gatekeep a little bit too hard, especially within anarcho-capitalist discords, where you end up with these really heated, in-depth debates over the philosophy, with both sides accusing the other of being a socialist. But seriously though, Kantian's ideas of morals, that they have to be based on reason and duty and not contradicting themselves, well, that's not really completely against objectivism. I mean, objectivism strives to be consistent and not contradict itself as well. For example, objectivists support the NAP because initiating violence or initiating aggression violates an individual's rights, whereas the Kantians might justify the NAP as some kind of universal maxim, or that it's the idea that you must respect others' autonomy, but that's not that meaningfully different than the objectivist justification. I mean, there's some key differences differences there, but they're both coming towards the reality of the nap. And plus, I would also disagree that Hoppe really is fully Kantian. Influenced by Kant, rationalist in a Kantian sense, kind of, but again, it's not as big of a deal as people think. For instance, I don't think Immanuel Kant ever actually denied objective reality. He just denied human infallibility. He denied humans' ability to ever fully, perfectly understand objective reality, but that's not the same thing at all as saying that there's no objective reality. And I think a lot of people get that confused and put a lot more weight behind this debate as a result of that confusion. Anyway, next question. Thoughts on the seasteading industry? I personally think the first Hoppian society will be based in international waters. Within the laws of how things currently operate, I can see how you might think that, but the problem is that seasteading is a lot more expensive than people give it credit for. That's my main problem with it. I mean, just forget the whole problem of tidal waves and everything like that. Just the prospect of building a city on water, it's kind of hoping for a technology that we don't really currently have yet. It's one of those things that could work in theory, but the engineering to make it work always just feels 50 years off. So they kind of suffer from a 2 more weeks mentality, but with decades. When's seasteading gonna work? When are we gonna finally have our free society on the open seas and build us this nice big floating city like Laputa, a castle in the sky but on the sea? Oh, well, we're gonna do it in 2 more decades. And what's gonna happen in 2 decades when we haven't successfully done it yet? Oh, well, it'll just be another 2 decades. Next question. I would like to see a video on why artists and writers and filmmakers and such as a whole tend to lean heavily to the left. That absolutely could use its own video, although there's a simple explanation to it, and that's just artistry in general kind of leans towards people who think a little bit more emotionally and kind of want to craft their own reality. And so I think leftism tends to attract people who think like that a bit more because it brings with it this bait that they could craft their own reality into actual reality. That they could actually make this utopian society where everyone's equal and everyone gets along and scarcity isn't a thing and everybody gets a free magical flying unicorn and yada yada yada. And the obvious truth is, of course, these are things that only exist in fairy tales, but unfortunately amongst people who have trouble telling the difference, they are more likely to be the artsy type than not. Next question. How would we deal with the lack of Fed and problems like banks not having someone to bail them out? Well, I mean, first of all, the Fed doesn't actually provide a real solution to that either. The Fed's system of bailing people out is just its relation to the US Mint and thus money printer go burr. If the Fed actually had to bail everybody out in that manner, then all it would mean would just be mass inflation. Which, I mean, you could argue in the heat of the moment, in the short term, is better than people not having their money at all. It's just important to understand that what the Fed does doesn't actually give us a kind of magical fix the economy wand for this specific problem. That's actually one of the main scams of the Fed. The US government likes to pretend that the Fed provides a simple solution that would prevent United States bank collapse, but the reality is if all the banks of the US started collapsing, then that would mean the world's trust in the US dollar is likely gone, and the reality is the Fed can do jack all about that. Rather, instead, what the Fed really does is it just seems to give people peace of mind that that won't happen, so long as the people never actually research how our fiat money system actually works. Now, that being said, the way that smaller banks would fix it in a more free market economy without the Fed, well, the likely result of that is that instead of having a few very large big banks that have various insurance plans behind them, you would have a lot more smaller banks, but still underneath likely a large insurance package. For example, if there's millions of banks and you're an insurance company insuring all of those banks, well, one of those banks going under isn't going to sink you. And plus, banks, just to be useful, they have to provide a service that is better than just hiding your money under your bed. So it's very unlikely that banks that have no kind of responsibility package or insurance plans to prevent those kind of worst case scenarios behind them, I doubt that they would get that many customers. And then, of course, you have other solutions like crypto, for example, which of course completely changes the question and whether or not they would need a bailout with more of a question of security. Like, for example, if you have an external crypto wallet on, say, Coinbase or something, then it just becomes a question of, okay, what guarantee do I have that these guys won't get hacked? And of course, you could have insurance packages for that as well. I mean, honestly, that's kind of the answer to a lot of questions of, but how would a non-centralized society solve this problem? Oh, well, with insurance, because that's all the centralized banking system really does. It doesn't make the banking system mysteriously better. It just has a way to turn the money printer on to make people think that a bailout is happening, when in reality, you're just kicking the problem down the road. land. Whereas on the flip side, the answer to a lot of the issues would just be insurance packages. Next question. Oh, it's a very long multi-question. We will just go with number 2. How do the companies own the city in a free city, especially in a monarchistic way? If a free city is able to secede and draw up new borders to create a new city anytime, does the company even own the land? How would personal ownership work? Well, first off, land ownership is just deduced by homesteading. It's the same thing as with the sort of usual simplification a lot of us give for this issue. Oh, Bob found a stick in the woods, and now Ralph wants to use the same stick. Ralph is in the wrong because, you know, Bob was using the stick first, and thus Ralph is just causing a conflict when there's plenty of other sticks. The same thing is seen with land, although it's a little bit more complicated with land. You have to specifically transform the land with your labor and show that you're using it in a necessary manner. Like, for instance, you can't just point to a mountain and say it's all mine. So yeah, it's another one of those complicated subjects. But as for owning the city goes, I think the best way to understand that in modern sense, in the way things currently work, a real world example that isn't exactly accurate, but it'll get you there at least to kind of understanding the basics, would be something like an ocean liner. A lot of passenger cruise ships can be described as a city on the sea, although one that moves as opposed to seasteading. You know, going back to the previous question on seasteading. But seriously though, those passenger cruise ships do give you a basic idea of how it works in terms of privatizing an entire freaking city. So for example, on a lot of these cruise ships, you might find something like Starbucks. And it's probably something that if you've ever been on one of those ships and you saw Starbucks operating on one of them, you probably thought nothing of it. But then let's ask ourselves seriously, okay, who owns the Starbucks on the cruise ship? How are these cruise ships even able to have Starbucks? I mean, are they the same company? Does Starbucks own the ship, or does the ship own the Starbucks but only on the ship? Because the answer can actually get a little bit convoluted there. In terms of the trademark, well, obviously Starbucks owns the trademark, so that part is handled with licensing agreements. But in terms of ownership, say they want to get rid of their Starbucks, well, then the answer kind of goes back to being a shareholder, as well as boring things like leasing arrangements. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect answer to this question because obviously a private city in the sea, in the way that a cruise liner is, they can't split the ship into 2 different ships if everybody wants to be a part of 2 different cities now. That part would actually be a lot easier to do on land. But hopefully you get the picture. In a private city, ownership of the land and ownership of the companies, and whether or not the companies own the city, or who owns what, etc., it's all done by a variety of contracts. Next question, what game is being played in the background of this video? You know, strangely enough, I get this question all the time. For those of you who don't know, I always include the game in the description of the video. It's right there underneath all the links. Although I suppose I could start including it in the video tags to lead to less confusion. Maybe. Next question, how do we win against wokeness? Oh, what a simple question with a difficult answer. Part of it, again, just comes down to understanding what wokeness actually is on a simplified level, which so many people don't get. Wokeness is just a collectivist envy, which then tries to justify itself through the equity fallacy. And so defeating wokeness just involves debunking both of those things, because both are wrong. Collective envy, along with collective guilt that it implies, doesn't actually work in society. Nobody actually believes it, or well, they pretend to believe it, and they'll say that they believe it, and they think that they believe it, unless they're the ones who are being held guilty for something somebody else did based on collectivism. That's kind of the funny thing about collective guilt, is that a lot of people who believe in collective guilt mysteriously stop believing in collective guilt when it's their arse over the fire. For example, you'll see those white people who are holding up signs saying white people should pay reparations. And then of course you ask them, okay, how much of your own money have you donated to this cause of paying reparations? And then they immediately, of course, backtrack and come up with a bunch of weird excuses. Like saying, oh, well, I'm an activist, so I'm absolved from guilt. Or some other weird mental backflip where they're convincing themselves that they're not accountable to their own claim. And then after that, it's just debunking the equity fallacy, which is a lot more work than it sounds. Because unfortunately, in the academic sphere of things, the equity fallacy is still seen as kind of the default explanation for everything. This kind of discrimination of the gaps is still very widely used in most studies. And refuting that stack of nonsense is going to take a whole lot more work. That's again why I say that thinking that wokeness is over is both delusional as well as wishful thinking, but on top of those 2 things, it just shows a serious amount of ignorance in what's actually going on behind the scenes. Next question. Have you heard Andrew Wilson's argument for limited democracy? No, I haven't. I've heard of Andrew Wilson, but I have not heard his argument for limited democracy. Apparently it's a similar position as mine, but comes from a very different worldview. Well, yeah, I'll just put it this way. If we're forced to stick with democracy, then we need to start unapologetically pushing for voting being limited to those with skin in the game. For instance, at the very least, having it be only for people who are net taxpayers. That's not perfect because taxation is theft, but it is better because then at the very least it's some of the people who are actually paying for the system who get to decide how the system is run. Whereas the current mantra madness of universal suffrage effectively dooms democracy into a downward spiral where idiots just vote for free stuff. And that's not just a consequentialist argument at this point anymore. We know for a fact that they will just vote for free stuff. Plebs will vote for whatever politician promises them free stuff. It is a basic flaw of democracy and there's no real getting around it, but making voting a privilege instead of a right is at least a somewhat effective stopgap to the madness. Next question. Do you think that Robert actually believes what he's saying here, or if it's just another narrative to try and convince the gullible that capitalism equals bad? In response to my mug readflation video where I debunked Robert Reich on saying that inflation is being caused by greed, rather than a spike in the money supply, which is what actually causes inflation. That's a really good question because honestly, it's impossible to know that one for sure. Honestly, when I'm looking over breadtuber arguments and, well, the arguments of various commie-light leaders like Robert Reich, it's really hard to tell if they actually believe it, or which one of them are just prestige-seeking cathedral-like grifters, as I like to call them. In the case of Robert, I'll put it this way. I suspect there's about a 60% chance that he actually believes what he's saying. But that comes with a caveat. I think that he intentionally doesn't really look much into the arguments against his position. He just kind of looks for whatever data can confirm his beliefs and then spews that data out without really considering the logic behind it. Either that or he's fully aware that the arguments didn't actually make sense and he's just a grifter. It's really hard to make the PPI versus CPI argument he made without knowing that it's not really an honest argument. And what I've come to realize is that it almost kind of doesn't matter if they're just genuinely dumb or if they're a grifter. Because either way, the answer to it is just refute what they're saying. And that's kind of been my bid when it comes to refuting breadtoids. I don't try to focus too much on why they are lying. I instead just try to focus on proving that they are lying. Because the truth is what matters in the end. Grifters gonna grift. Next question. Is it bad that all gamers and all game devs are becoming more like socialists and that we have no choice but to physically remove them entirely? Well, with a lot of gamers becoming woke, that's just some gamers falling for the woke propaganda. Because the issue is that game development among AAA studios was kind of the final target of the cathedral's ideological capture of intellectual institutions. Yes, I know that kind of sounds a little bit pretentious to say that the game industry is an intellectual institution, but the thing is they kind of are. They mainly trade in ideas. They are selling an intellectual product. Fortunately, however, I think this is one of those issues that will kind of solve itself. If you take care of wokeness at its root, then the game industry will actually probably be the first industry to bounce back. Because the thing is, gaming at its core is actually kind of inherently anti-woke. Because think about it, gaming presents a challenge, and you either successfully beat that challenge or you don't. There's no blaming anybody else. There's no blaming some mysterious force of systemic discrimination for why you didn't beat a game. So while gaming is mostly just goofing off, there's an inherent slight amount of work ethic behind it and how it works. I mean, most of the time you're effectively just simulating hunting, which is, pretty based. Next question. How do you distinguish intelligence from reasoning ability? Well, intel kind of requires a bit of knowledge. That's kind of what intel means. It is defined as information that has some kind of value to it. Whereas reasoning ability is very similar to intelligence, but unlike intelligence, reasoning ability doesn't necessarily require knowledge. I think the best example to this, it comes from a video I was talking about earlier, would be the Raven's test. Raven's progressive matrices test doesn't really require you to know much at all. It only requires an intelligence of basic literacy. But other than that, it's just very straightforward pattern recognition, and so reasoning ability is going to help you a lot more than any kind of pre-knowledge you have going into the test. It's just, hey, here's some shapes, what comes next, what fits the pattern. And that's what distinguishes it, and that's one of the things as well that kind of gets the midwits mad, because midwits tend to only have slightly above average reasoning ability or average reasoning ability, but they're also often fairly well educated, coming from an upper middle class, having their degree in liberal arts and whatnot, and they like to think that being smart means being educated and read, and while being well read is important, you do need reasoning ability. And so a lot of times midwits, when faced with pattern recognition requirements, they get very upset. They don't like it when you point out that they're really not that clever. Anyway, hopefully that clears it up for you. Next question. Hey Mentis, are you working on a video based on the censorship and delisting of games currently going on? No, I am not currently working on a video like that, but I have thought of it. I have a very, very, very ridiculously long list of video ideas that I haven't actually started working on. Kind of on the same lines of the sin of having a massive Steam backlog of those games that you're totally going to play one day, but let's be honest, you're probably not going to get to them. With me, I just have a massive list of hundreds of ideas with some basics down on it, which means I guess you could say that this is one of the things I'm working on, but I only have a few lines of basic bullet points written about it. But since you mention it, it does seem to be something that people care about. It is an important issue, and it's also, a pretty stereotypical example of intellectual property abuse. So I'll bump that one up the list. No promises though. Or actually, I'll say this, if it's still a major issue in about 4 weeks, then I'll make a video on it, especially with the whole Visa and MasterCard debunking thing. That's a big can of worms. Anyway, next question. When will you do another high-octane video on a single bread tuber? Oh, really good question. Yeah, I'm gonna try and make one of those this month, although it's not gonna be a single bread tuber. It's gonna focus on maybe about 3 of them. I might do 4, and it's gonna be primarily about right anarchy versus left anarchy, and whether or not the right should drop the term anarchy for anarcho-capitalism. And I'm gonna kind of largely focus on refuting a lot of the nonsense coming from left anarchists. So yeah, another one of those videos is coming. As for when I'll do one on a single bread tuber, that I'm not sure of. I've been considering taking down some of Philosophy Tube's nonsense, but the thing with Philosophy Tube is that it's so silly and milquetoast that I'm not sure explaining why it is wrong would actually convince any of the people who need to listen to it. I mean, kind of going to the previous question about intelligence versus reasoning ability, Philosophy Tube is one of those things where if you actually believe that crap, chances are you're lacking in pattern recognition skills, and so chances are I can't help them. Next question. How many of these apply to Vaush in response to the midwit tier list? Stupid things that smart people believe. Honestly, I would say about 90% of them, sadly. Vaush is just kind of a very stereotypical white guilt midwit, which sadly and annoyingly amongst the libs is probably the most common type of midwit, at least in the West. And at least here I see them a lot in Portland State University, because unfortunately wokeism is still just kind of the default philosophy for people who haven't really put much thought into it. If you go through a sociology course and you just believe everything that the professor tells you without question, without really thinking about praxis or epistemology or things like that, well, the logical conclusion of that, the standard creation that happens when you go through that, at least in the way our universities currently operate, people like Vaush is just kind of the stereotypical, well-read but completely clueless, indoctrinated follower of the cult of woke. Again, at the core of it, the problem is that the equity fallacy is still treated as kind of the de facto answer to any kind of disparate outcome. As long as the cathedral or the regime or whatever you want to call it is primarily thinking that way, then well, it's just going to be a midwit factory. It's going to churn out people like Vaush at a dime a dozen, which is unfortunate but also completely understandable. I don't like that there's this many people who think this way, but considering how the power structures and dynamics currently work in our society, it's at least easy to understand why so many of them think that way. Next question. My instant response to appeal to authority is Ozempic. People who could lose plenty of weight exercising regularly are being pushed to take glutamates because doctors and hospitals get paid for the extra visits needed to prescribe the drug. Yes, big pharma is a problem. In fact, I recently made a tweet about this. The issue with the pharma industry is that it's so heavily regulated that it just creates these ridiculous, unnatural monopolies, and that just naturally breeds distrust. When you have a centralized, unaccountable authority that can just pretty much fire anybody, then you end up with very few people who have the title expert, TM, being willing to speak out against them because they're afraid that they'll lose their job. So you kind of need to somewhat get along with big pharma and largely do what they say if you want to be a medical service provider in the United States at least. And yes, that actually is a pretty good example of why appeal to authority doesn't really work very well. It's very obvious to any rational person that shoving drugs down people isn't the answer to everything, especially when a lot of these drugs have been proven to have side effects many years down the road. Like for example, it's kind of a known fact that a lot of heartburn meds like proton pump inhibitors can potentially lead to chronic migraines down the line. They can cause a lot of issues, and yet they're prescribed by the truckloads. And the sad thing is, doctors, a lot of them really have no idea how those drugs really function. While we do understand the mechanism of some drugs, a lot of them are actually very poorly understood. A lot of them, the study that supports the drug being used just showed that the drug showed an effect that they wanted. Oh, patient has symptom A and they take this drug and symptom A goes away, with a statistical significance higher than that of the placebo group. And the patients who took the drug didn't die 3 months later, so hey, I guess the drug's good to go. Which then shows kind of another issue with big pharma, which is that a lot of the medical research industry, well, because of the way patents work, their incentive is to create drugs that just create customers. Or in other words, drugs that treat the symptom and make the symptom go away, but don't actually treat the illness. So that way they have a continuous customer that needs to get the drug at the pharmacy every month or so, constantly buying these drugs, which they can then jack the prices up sky high due to patent abuse. So yeah, it's a very, very exploitive system. That is actually another one of the topics at the top of my videos to make, is the problems with the FDA and big pharma, and how the medical system in the United States can be massively improved, even if we were to just use simple compromise level things like getting rid of patent abuse by removing patent evergreening or something like that. It's actually kind of infuriating almost, just how many easy solutions there are that would just immediately reduce prices for millions of people. It's a very, very evil system, and it's been a long time coming that they get hard exposed. Next question, do you ship to P.O. boxes? Yes, if you use standard shipping, you should be able to ship to a P.O. box. I've only heard issues with P.O. boxes when it comes to trying to use express shipping, which doesn't really matter. I mean, it's just waiting an extra day. Standard shipping is slightly less expensive usually, but otherwise, yes. Next question, how many people in the world both subscribe to libertarianism and you would trust them to not vote themselves more free stuff? Now, this question is kind of a silly one, because I would actually say that anybody who votes for more free stuff isn't really a libertarian. That's actually something that I would hard gatekeep being a libertarian on. If you're voting for free stuff, then that means you think voting for free stuff can work, which means you're not really a libertarian. Because if you were a libertarian, then you would understand why that's ultimately harmful and doesn't work. Which unfortunately means that on that note, a lot of people in the world currently don't subscribe to libertarianism because of all the knuckle draggers currently voting for free stuff. Very sad, but that's how it is. Next question. Where do you draw your QA questions from? That is a good one, and I figure I will say it right here, since this is a QA video after all. So for these quarterly QA videos that I'm going to do, you may have noticed that I started with channel members and subscribe stars, and yeah, it's fair that they get first dibs. But after that, anybody who is a public subscriber and I see a question from you, then it has a chance of showing up in these quarterly QA videos, which, unlike subscribe star and being a channel member, is free. Anybody could be a public subscriber. And as for the question of venture capital, how would you solve for venture capital? It seems to my mind like it is pure unbridled capitalism, but it also so often ends in disaster for suppliers, customers, and shareholders of companies. Yeah, venture capital is one of the downsides of the free market, which is that you are going to ultimately allow gambling. Venture capital is effectively just higher IQ gambling. And the answer to it is really just decentralization. The reason venture capital tends to be more destructive in the way the world currently operates is that a lot of times it goes in the hands of large corporations, which, you know, tends to harm a lot of people in the way. Whereas if things are more decentralized, you end up seeing venture capital at a smaller scale. Still gambling, and it's still often a bad idea, but ultimately the way a libertarian society, specifically the Hoppian vision of it, multiple covenant communities and all that, you know, the damage and accountability when it comes to venture capital ends up being smaller enough in scale that the economy can always bounce back from it. And it is also another argument for physical removal. Gambling is something that a lot of people won't want to associate themselves with, and thus a lot of private cities just won't have it. Next question. How would physical removal work across generations? I.e., when children grow to be commies and then inherit their parents' property, how do you deal with them? Well, ultimately, when a fool inherits money, they end up losing their money. And yes, it is annoying when an idiot manages to gain power that they don't deserve, because unfortunately there just isn't an easy answer to it. That's why it's kind of always been a problem throughout human history. Like, especially if you study European history, it is full of examples of where a lot of idiots managed to get born into nobility, and of course, as a result, they caused problems. Lots and lots of problems. And here's the thing that most people don't realize, which is that those problems are generally made worse by the state. You know that corrupt relationship that large corporations tend to have with the state that we like to call corporatism, where they lobby the state for favors? Well, that's also a way for idiots to stay in power. When you take away those political favors, then businesses are more forced to bear the brunt of the responsibility for allowing a moron to call the shots. And so while it would be entirely possible for a large business owner to leave their business to some communist offspring, in a free market that's generally going to result in the end of the business. So it's a problem, but it's never a permanent problem. Next question. Does evolution count as soft science? And by that I mean macroevolution. It isn't quite about the human condition, but it doesn't really follow scientific method. Considering the time scale required, is impossible to actually do the scientific method with that. Sort of. So one thing I will say is that people who are right-leaning need to stop giving into the YEC madness of attacking evolution. It makes us look really dumb. I know you didn't mention religion, but it's something I see a lot of the religious right do, and it just comes across as, well, this scientific theory doesn't jive with our religion, therefore the theory must not be true. And it just comes across as very deeply unserious. That being said, I'll answer the question, because it is actually kind of a good question. Does it count as soft science if some parts of it are hard to test? And the answer is no, it really isn't soft science. Well, sort of, because the thing is you can test it, at least to the same degree that you can test any kind of archaeology. I think it's more accurate to say that things like that aren't an exact science. So much like a historian might study hieroglyphics, and then from that they try to make inferences about what the Egyptian people may have thought and what they may have believed back then, based on what they wrote. When in reality there is an actual probability, a low probability, that being said, but there is a real probability that the Egyptian people actually didn't believe a lot of the things that they wrote in their hieroglyphics. We can't travel back in time to talk with them and have an interview with them about it, and so for all we know, the entire Egyptian afterlife is in fact a very elaborate troll, where the Egyptian people thought, oh, we're gonna write all this stuff down, and in thousands of years, those silly historians are gonna think that we believed all this crap, when in reality we didn't, which of course is very, very unlikely, but I mean, technically, you can't disprove it 100%. And I think evolution kind of has the same issue. A lot of what you would call macroevolution just comes from studying the fossil record and our understanding of genetics. And for all we know, it could all just be a very big, massive coincidence. Very unlikely to be a big, massive coincidence, but it could be a massive coincidence. However, I would avoid calling it a soft science because there is still a very physical fossil record there for them to study. Next question. It's ironic that you're having health issues pertaining to your back because Kirsche has also had some health issues caused by her back. Anybody else find it interesting how Mentiswave and Kirsche have never been in the same room at the same time? Oh boy, cue the weird conspiracy theory. You know, that would be one heck of a voice changer if me and Kirsche were the same person. I think that would even be better than most AI voice changers. That'd be really hard to pull off. But no, the thing about my health issues regarding that is it's the main reason why I haven't really been doing that many collaborations lately and why I'm usually doing one video a week instead of one video every 5 days like I used to do. It is very not good and unfortunately has nothing to do with me secretly being somebody else. Next question. How do you build roads and massive projects without a state? You know, I've answered this question before. I think at this point, I just need to make a roads video. That is yet another video that I will have to bump up the line. In wild capitalism, one dude builds a road and can just charge whatever the price he wants because you can't build another road on top of his. Well, actually, yes, you can. I mean, you legit can just build a road on top of his. But yep, another video that have to go higher up the list. Next question. ANCAP fundraising for their healthcare is just incredible in so many ways. Are you implying ANCAPs like the current healthcare system? Now, this one, of course, is less of a question and more of a point. I think a lot of the far lefties, you know, the ones who want the free stuff in terms of free healthcare, I think what a lot of them don't realize is that we're actually, at least those of us on the far libertarian right, we're more against the current healthcare system than they are. They actually want effectively the same healthcare system. The only difference is they want it for free. But that's not a meaningful real difference aside from just economic illiteracy. In fact, the biggest problem with making it quote-unquote free is that it largely just maintains the status quo of the FDA. It doesn't actually fix the deeper problems behind the healthcare industry that cause it to cost so much. So even if socialized medicine was, in economic terms, a good idea, it would still just be a band-aid fix at best. And the libertarian right, specifically the Mises Institute types, I mean, we have given pretty long lists of very serious, very critical reforms to the healthcare industry, like changing the patent system into an investor's market for starters, both to reduce the price of drugs, but also to make it so that research and development is based on what patients actually want, which is, you know, actual cures, as opposed to getting turned into customers, because all the drugs that are based on the current patent system, well, the incentive behind that isn't to make drugs that actually cure the illness, but just to make drugs that get rid of the symptoms in order to turn patients into cash cows. And we would scrap that entirely. And then I see people on the left, especially young far leftists who want their universal healthcare, they assume that those of us on the libertarian right are in favor of the status quo, when we would completely destroy the status quo. We would actually make more changes to healthcare than they would. It's kind of funny and ironic, actually. Anyway, that's enough QA for now. Kind of want to answer more, but unfortunately not feeling that well. But I will do another one of these before the end of the year. So thanks a lot for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And yes, there is a Ron Paul Was Right merch on the merch store, which you can buy to support the channel. So again, that is all. Till next time.